Good morning. Good morning. It's good to see y'all here this morning on the third Sunday of Easter season, and it is still Easter for us in the Episcopal Church and in the Lutheran Church and in the Roman Catholic Church. It is still our season of new life and new energy, our season of blooming and growing, our season of spiritual power and profound forgiveness. It is the season where God's judgment, God's greatest judgment, has been issued. And it is a judgment of peace and love and mercy. It's a judgment of joy and of abundance. Now, don't lie. How many of you have thought about God's judgment in that way before? That God can issue a judgment, but that is a good thing. God's judgment can be love or mercy or grace. Judgment is just making a decision, right? And in this most important moment in time, God made this most important decision, and this decision was love, mercy, abundance, peace, and joy. That is because God does not ultimately wish to destroy. Far from it, actually, God wishes to repair, and that is the judgment of God that we see today, healing and repairing. God's judgment. God is judging here, and that judgment ends up being a beautiful thing. And I say that because both Acts and in the gospel reading this morning, we see God's judgment of peace and love and mercy in full form. We see Jesus Christ stepping right into the middle of the brokenness and being an agent of healing, right into the strife and being a reconciler. So we all have to pay attention because this is the Lord whom we are to follow and emulate. So these sort of things concern us a great deal. Firstly, we heard from the book of Acts of the conversion of St. Paul. Now, I know St. Paul was not perfect, and sometimes he does get a little carried away, and sometimes other people get a little carried away with him, but let me just lay it out there like this and say that he was a model for us all in a great many respects. And when Acts tells this story, it begins by saying that the man was still breathing threats and murder against followers of the way, which is another way of saying he was still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of Jesus. He was a persecutor of those who loved and followed the Lord. And he was apparently pretty good at it, and he spared no one. He bound them all and brought them to the temple in Jerusalem so that the authorities could pronounce a judgment of death and condemnation on them. The opposite kind of judgment that God gives us at Easter time. And Paul got the payment. And Paul would keep the money from the authorities. You see, at this point, Paul was an awful lot like Judas. Except at least Judas was decent enough not to keep the money. And here we see that Paul, called Saul at this point, was on his way to get some support for his threats and his murder. And at this point, our Lord appears as a light from heaven, flashing all around him, knocking Paul to the ground, and a voice arises from that light saying, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" Saul responds, "Who are you?" This light, this voice, this spiritual experience was so powerful that when Saul spoke to that light and voice from heaven, he actually ended up calling it Lord. He says, "Who are you, Lord?" And that lordly voice responds, "I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting." Now, Jesus at this point could be a lot of people here. He could have said, "I am that African American boy or girl that you'd rather lock up than lift up." You know what I mean? Jesus could have said, "I'm that Latino family that you'd rather deport than befriend." You know what I mean? Jesus could have said, "I am that woman or that child that you would rather abuse than respect." You know what I mean? Jesus could have said, "I'm that queer person that you would rather mock and judge rather than respect and love." Do you know what I mean? Jesus could have said, "I am that poor person that you would rather look over and walk past and pretend they're just not there instead of care for them." You know what I mean? Amen. Jesus could have said, "I'm that elderly person that you pretend doesn't exist anymore because you think I'm just not worth the time, the effort, or the energy, and you leave locked up and lonely all day." Amen. You know what I mean? Yes. I know you know what I mean. Jesus could have been an awful lot of people here. Saul went on to become called Paul and be baptized and become one of the most active members of the church, spreading the gospel all around the Roman Empire, and he ultimately lost his life for it. Got his head cut off. And a similar thing happens with Peter here in the gospel reading. Jesus appears to the disciples for a third time, and this time they don't recognize him at first, but eventually they do. Jesus appears to them on a beach and he speaks to them. He helps them catch fish, and they pull in a pretty large haul, and then they all have breakfast together. You see what's happening here? Jesus is showing up and he's taking care of his flock. Or better yet, he's showing up and taking care of people that he called friends right before he died. Simon Peter is here, and he is asked 3 times by Jesus if he loves him. Peter says, "Lord, of course I do." Every single time, though the third time hurt him a little. It pained him a little. Every time Jesus asks, and every time Peter answers. And Jesus tells him to go and take care of his disciples. Now, in case you missed it, during Holy Week, Peter denied Jesus 3 times on the night he was betrayed and crucified. And here, Jesus is giving Peter, who denied him 3 times, 3 chances to say, "Lord, I love you." Amen. For each time Peter did wrong, he got a chance to make it right again. And he didn't even have to go looking for that chance to do it. Jesus came to him and gave him the perfect setup for it. Gave him that forgiveness on a silver platter. It not only came to him and forgave him, but then gave Peter some responsibilities in the community. He wiped that slate clean and gave him some responsibilities instead of hanging it over his head for the rest of his life. And the surprising thing here is that Jesus did not judge those negatively who had done him wrong or had done harm to his way and his followers. He finds the ones, he finds Paul, he finds Peter who had done wrong and applies the needed balm on those wounds. When we came in this morning, what did we sing? There is a balm in Gilead. Jesus shows up, he calls them out, sure, but then he raises them up, and then their ministries blossom, and they become 2 of the most influential leaders in the early church. They found new life. That is how you repair broken relationships in the Christian church. Amen. There's a call out, and then there's a lifting up. Now, sometimes people have a hard time with the call out and don't always know how to address problems in a constructive way. Amen. And then there are other people, and I will not name names here, who are more than happy to call people out as loud as they can, as many times as they can, and end up doing more harm than good because they aren't actually interested in repairing that relationship, and they haven't given as much thought as to how to move forward and lift the person up than just be criticized. I would say that Jesus calls for compassion here on both fronts. And Jesus shows us how to do it. He confronts Paul, who is literally about to go out and try to have some people killed, by asking Paul a question. Why are you doing this? Why? Is this the kind of person you want to be? Are these the kinds of decisions you want to make? Peter denies Jesus 3 times, and the way Jesus confronts that problem is not by fussing him out, but by asking Peter 3 times whether or not he really loves him. Where the world saw 3 failings, 3 betrayals, 3 mistakes, the Lord saw 3 chances to make things right, 3 opportunities to do what is good. Let me ask you, Peter's famous for his 3 denials, right? Is he equally famous for his 3 I love you statements? No. No, he's not. But that is how Jesus' judgment works. And that is how our judgment should work too. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that if you're in a relationship of physical or emotional or spiritual abuse, you should stick around in that. If you find yourself stuck in something like that, the message of the resurrection is one of new life and of fresh air in a closed room, of peace in a place of fear and violence. If you're stuck in some such abuse, leave. Leave. You owe no one anything. Leave. Don't be afraid to get the help that you need to seek new life. You're doing the work of Christ by doing that. Some relationships just need to be ones of distance. No, I'm talking about most other relationships where we mess with other people's lives, sometimes out of spite, sometimes out of jealousy, sometimes out of a need for control, or just out of plain old hate and meanfulness. And sometimes we just do it because we aren't really sure why, until we sit down and ask ourselves. I'm talking about holding on to anger and guilt rather than letting them go. I'm talking about holding on to a big mistake and holding it over someone's head and not letting them move on. I'm talking about refusing to move on from it ourselves too. The definitive Christian response to that kind of nonsense is to get with the program and start getting over. To start overcoming pettiness and the grudges without collecting new ones. To start getting over our need to mess with other people's lives and stick our noses in where they don't belong and judge others in a negative way and put stumbling blocks in their way, and don't start doing it in new ways once you've let go of the old patterns of behavior. The definitive Christian response to the breaks and the tears in our relationships and in our fractured world is to locate those problems and start talking about them in a way that leads to healing. That is how we emulate Christ. That is how we really truly spread the gospel, and that is how we become part of God's dream for a world where peace and justice reign in human hearts. Amen. Be willing to reach out to other people and say, I don't really know how to make things better from here, but I know I want to. And I know that if we let the Holy Spirit work, we can reconcile, and I want our relationship to get better. Amen. If you can do that, then you're doing what Jesus did when he appeared to Paul and Peter. If you do that, then you are being like Saints Peter and Paul when they determined to turn their lives around and start following Christ, accepting responsibility as members of the community. You'll be surprised, honest to goodness, you will be surprised by how much better life can be when you're willing to forgive in this way. It's hard to do it first, but you will be surprised at how free you feel later. And you might even be surprised to find that as you walk down this difficult path yourself, you will run into Jesus too, the same way Peter and Paul did. And I pray that you do. Amen.